It's been suggested that science and faith are two totally separate ideas, and that the one should not get into the area of the other and vice versa, and that they don't overlap at all. In fact, when we come to the Bible, especially certain people in the scientific community say, well, the Bible is not a science book. It's not something that should be looked at in a scientific way. It's talking about totally different things, and it's talking about more philosophical ideas, and you can't expect the Bible to be scientifically accurate because, it's written many hundreds and many thousands of years ago. Certain parts of it were written in about 1450 BC. You're looking at almost 3,500 years ago. And they would suggest that modern science would have disproven lots of the statements in the Bible. But they would say, but the Bible is designed for faith, and it doesn't matter if it gets scientific ideas incorrectly. It still can be used for faith-type situations and discussions, and those two, faith and science, are totally separate. Well, that's just not true. In fact, the truth of the matter is that if the Bible is the inspired Word of God, and we would argue that it is, and if God, the creator of the universe, wrote the words that we have in the 66 books of the Bible, then we would expect everything written in the Bible to be completely true and to correspond accurately with reality. You know, the idea of science is really just the search for knowledge and truth, and lots of times people pigeonhole that science idea to mean only physical truth, things that you can touch, see, taste, hear, or smell. And even if that were the case, in a sense, it's really not. But even if it were, you could still apply all of the rigors of the scientific discipline to the Bible. And the Bible would prove to be accurate in every single instance. And what we're going to find out is not only would it prove to be accurate in every single instance, but there's something in the Bible that is called scientific foreknowledge. And that is when the writers put into the text information and material that people at the time, well, they had no real way to know that it was important. They couldn't have known why it was included. They wouldn't have had an understanding of the various intricacies of the science involved, of the germs, or of the various different physics and things of that nature. But later, in fact, many times, many hundreds or thousands of years later, the accumulative knowledge of the human race got to be such that we then could look back and say, oh, we see exactly why that was written 3,000 years ago, and it makes perfect scientific sense. And so that idea of scientific foreknowledge. You see, when you go to the Bible and you're asking if the Bible is the inspired Word of God, but what you have to be able to do is prove that the Bible contains characteristics and traits that mere human beings just simply could not put in the text by themselves. And that's why we would say it has a supernatural author. And when we look to this idea of scientific foreknowledge, what we find is that absolutely positively there are things written that mere men could not have known the importance of what they were writing when they were writing it. And we're going to be discussing lots of the science and the Bible throughout this summer series here at Riverchase, and we think that you're really going to enjoy many of the things that we pull out from the text, and I think it's going to open your eyes to the fact that not only did God speak the world into existence, and not only does He understand every single aspect of the physical and what some people would say the scientific world, but when He wrote the Bible, every word that He put in the text is an accurate representation of what's going on in the physical world when it can be compared to that physical world. And so the idea that faith and science are totally separate categories or totally separate disciplines that should be kept apart and they don't overlap, well, that's just not true. In fact, the truth is when you take the Bible and faith, and you take science and you compare them, what is true in the Bible and faith areas and what is true in the scientific areas will always fit perfectly as it relates to the Creator and as it relates to the Creator's Word, the Bible, that we find in the 66 books from Genesis to Revelation that we have and read and understand to be the inspired Word of God. Now, we're going to be looking at that idea of scientific foreknowledge in several different lessons, but in this lesson, you might be surprised to understand that we're going to nail it down to a very specific category. And that very specific category is going to be the food regulations that we find in Leviticus chapter 11. That's it. It's as far as we're going is Leviticus chapter 11 and the food regulations. What is it in our nation, in our country, that regulates what we can and cannot eat? I mean, you might say, well, nothing regulates what I can and cannot eat. I'm going to eat what I want to, and there's a certain sense where that's true. But what group or what organization or association makes it where certain things are legal to sell as food and for humans to consume, and certain things are illegal? Well, we have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And that Food and Drug Administration makes decisions based on the most up-to-date, modern, scientific ideas as to what is healthy, what is unhealthy, what can do harm, what is actually good for the body. And so there are certain regulations that the FDA says you can sell this as food for humans if you do this to it, if you package it this way, etc. Well, if we were to go back to the time of Moses in 1450 BC, and ask, was there any type of food and drug administration then? Well, you certainly know there was not. In fact, the nations all around the Israelites were eating and consuming any number of things that could be potentially very harmful for them. And God makes some rules there in the Old Testament about what the Israelites can and cannot do. And He says these rules are going to be for your good always. And some of them we would feel like we're very constraining. But God's instructions, He says, when the nations around you see how prosperous you are, how long you live, and how healthy your nation as a whole is, then they're going to recognize that your wisdom, what keeps you so healthy and prosperous and blessed, is the law that I have given you. And you go to that law and you start to see these food regulations for the Israelites. You find them in Leviticus chapter 11, and we're going to start there. And there were just certain rules about land-living creatures and water-living creatures and flying creatures, etc., that helped the Israelites understand what they could and could not eat, what they could and could not touch. And so you get there to Leviticus chapter 11, and you start right there in verse 2. And the text says, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all the beasts that are on the earth." So here's what you can and cannot eat. This is the equivalent of the Old Testament Food and Drug Administration. Well, what is it, Moses, through inspiration, that we can and cannot eat? Start in verse 3 there. "Among the beasts, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves and chewing the cud, that you may eat." Verse 4, "Nevertheless, these you shall not eat. Among those that chew the cud, or those that have cloven hooves, the camel, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, it's unclean to you. The rock hyrax," and it starts listing several specifically. And then it gets down to 7, "And the swine," pigs, "though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, it is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall not eat, their carcasses you shall not touch, they are unclean to you." So simple rules. We can understand them well. They have to have a split hoof, cloven, that's what it means, it has to be split, and they have to chew their cud. Now, what animals have a split hoof and chew their cud? Those would be deer and cattle and goats and sheep and various animals of those sorts. Now, here's what a cud chewer is. They are herbivores, which means they're just going to be eating grass and plants and herbs. Herbivores, that's the name. They just eat plants. And many of these, like a cow or a deer, they're designed to go into a field, and if they see a lot of good grass, well, they're designed to be able to clip that grass off with their teeth very, very quickly, and they swallow it very quickly. And they don't have many good natural defense mechanisms, and their best one is to run away. And so if they see a good source of food, their design is such that they can go into that source of food and take a lot of it in, but they didn't chew it enough for it to be digested. I think you guys probably understand that. If you've ever seen maybe a youth group come into 30 Domino's pizzas, you know, those 16-year-old boys, sometimes they throw that stuff down and they don't even seem to chew it enough for it to be digested. Well, that's what you see a deer or a cow doing, but it has several compartments in its stomach, and later when it feels safe, it will lay down and it will regurgitate that grass that it has clipped hastily, and then it will re-chew it. That's called chewing the cud. Maybe you've seen a sheep or a cow in a field sitting down or lying down, and they are chewing something, and that is that grass that they clipped off very quickly. Now, the animals that are specifically mentioned, like the swine, the pig, you know, the pig has a cloven hoof, but it doesn't chew its cud. And here's a reason why a pig doesn't chew its cud: because it's not an herbivore. In fact, a pig is called an omnivore. Now, you know what the word, or it's the prefix omni means. Omni means all. You know, if God is omnipresent, what does that mean? He's present everywhere. If God is omniscient, that's omniscient. What does that mean? He knows everything. If God is omnibenevolent, what does that mean? Well, it means God is all good. So what does omnivorous mean? Well, it just simply means that pigs will eat anything. And when I say anything, they will eat virtually anything. They'll eat meat, and they'll eat plants, and they'll eat fur and claws and hair and just about everything else. When I was at Freed-Hardeman, there was a place where man let us dove hunt, and it was over a pig lot, a pig feed lot, and there was electric fence around it. And you would stay outside of the fence and you would shoot doves. But if you shot a dove and it fell into the pig lot, well, if you didn't get there before the pig, then the pig would eat the dove. But of course the pig doesn't pluck the dove. The pig doesn't get rid of any of the parts that we would get rid of before we would eat dove meat. No, the pig just eats the thing whole. Eats its beak, eats its feathers, eats the insides of the dove, eats it all. But now here's what I found very interesting as well. If you accidentally shucked your plastic shotgun shell into the pig feedlot, the pig would then eat the plastic shotgun shell. But when I say pigs were omnivorous, they'll eat just about anything. And when you start looking at what that would cause, you realize that pigs would take in parasites that herbivores like a goat or a sheep or a cow just simply would not. And the probability of getting some type of parasite or foodborne disease from pigs is much higher than from pork, than from beef, or than from sheep, or than from goats, etc. And so, if you wanted to regulate what foods would be best for eating while you're out in the wild. You know, of course, now they tell us, hey, if you will cook pork and get all of the meat to an internal temperature of 160 degrees, then you'll kill all those parasites. But think about that. If years ago, about 5 years ago, if you went into a steakhouse and you ordered a ribeye steak, and they would ask you, how do you want that cooked? Rare, medium, rare, medium well. You could say, I'd like it rare, just about as rare as you can make it. Just, sizzle one side, flip it over, sizzle the other for a minute or two, and then just bring it to me. And you could order a beef steak rare. But if you went into that same steak joint and you said, I want a pork chop, do you know they wouldn't ask you how you wanted that cooked, as far as they wouldn't say, do you want it rare or medium rare? In fact, pork several years ago was regulated to that you could not even buy it cooked rare or medium rare in a restaurant. Now, incidentally, it has changed, and from what I understand, we have regulated the pork industry so well that we have cut down on the trichinosis and other diseases that would be passed in pork meat, and so we have also injected it with various nitrates and nitrites that would kill some of those things. And so in the United States, we basically have eradicated most of the parasites, and so now you can go in and order a medium rare or rare pork chop. Now, I don't think I'm going to take them up on that, but as I understand it, the regulation has changed. But if you were looking around in the wild and you were catching or trapping or hunting pigs in the wild, if you did not cook those pigs to 160 degrees internal temperature, there was a great chance that you were going to get some type of parasite. Think about this. You've got upwards of 2 million Israelites wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. Where are you going to get the kind of firewood to build fires all throughout the camp to properly cook pork to 160 degrees internal temperature? Well, you're not going to have an opportunity to do that. Certainly not on a nightly or a weekly or whatever it was basis. And so you can see why this regulation would have been very, very beneficial, because you're lowering the chance dramatically, tremendously, of the children of Israel getting any type of parasites from the meat that they consume. And I think it's an interesting fact, just incidentally, that lots of times the archaeologists, as they are studying the remains of various different cultures and a village or a campsite or something like that, one of the primary ways that they identify if it was an Israelite camp or if it was some type of other nation around the Israelites, Canaanites, Hivites, Jebusites, etc., is that they would look in the garbage. Well, what would you find in the garbage heap of the Chaldeans that you wouldn't find in the garbage heap of the Israelites? Pork bones. And so that was one of the things that separated the campsites from the Israelites, the campsites of the Israelites from those of the other nations around them. They just didn't consume pork. And what that would have done for them is kept them from getting those foodborne diseases that were so prevalent in pork meat because of that pig's omnivorous nature. Well, that's one example. Let me give you another example. As you continue down the list, you start to see, okay, this isn't some random point and shoot selection by God of, well, I'll just let them eat this, and I won't let them eat that, and I'll let them eat this. This is a very, to say very well thought out is even an understatement. It's the perfect list of rules in a very short nutshell that would encompass basically all the food consumption decisions that the Israelites would make, and it keeps them from, like God promised, keeps them from getting the diseases that lots of the people in the nations around them were getting. And so you continue with, that's the land-living creatures, and then you go there to the water-dwelling creatures. And you go right there in verse 9, these you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, those you may eat. But all in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water, a living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. So there again, another simple rule. Fins and scales. If they have fins but no scales, can't eat them. If they have scales but no fins, can't eat them. They have to have both. Now you start thinking about some of the things that we consume from out of the oceans or the rivers, etc., that don't have scales and fins. Oysters? Do oysters live in water? Absolutely. Do they have scales and fins? No. Well, okay, Kyle, what's the big deal about an oyster? Well, the big deal about an oyster is oysters can get a bacteria that is, you can't see it, you can't smell it, and you can't taste it. And to certain categories of people, it has a 50% kill rate. That means if two people eat it, then one of them is going to die. That's how deadly this particular bacteria is. And there are rules about eating oysters lots of times for all of those people who like to eat oysters, especially raw oysters. Now I'll eat a fried oyster periodically, but I've never really gotten on board with the raw oyster. The texture of it just seems so I don't know, something that I don't really want to have a part of. But I know a lot of people, boy, they like that oyster on the half shell, and they flip it down, it just slides right. Anyway, some people love some oysters. But here's the rule for eating oysters, basically. You don't eat an oyster in any month that doesn't have, not a raw one, an R in it. May, June, July, August. Well, why wouldn't you not eat an oyster? Why would it be that you didn't eat oysters in any month that doesn't have an R in it? Well, those are the hot months. And oysters, if they get to a certain temperature, there's a chance that that bacteria is going to grow in those oysters. And you can understand, you can imagine what might happen. Let's say you've got a guy who's got a refrigerated truck, And that refrigerator truck is rolling down the road, and it's got $50,000 worth of oysters in it, but somehow the refrigeration goes out. And it's only for 10 minutes, but it heats that truck up to 80, 90, 9,500 degrees just for 10 minutes. Now, here's the option. You can tell your boss that you forgot to flip on the refrigeration switch and cost the company $50,000, or, hey, it cooled down low enough to where it's regular temperature now, and you could just deliver them and hope nothing happened. Well, if that were the case, and that truck driver did deliver those oysters, and they had reached 90, 9,500 degrees just for a brief time, and that bacteria started to grow in those oysters, well, you can look at the CDC right now, and there is a pamphlet on oyster consumption. CDC, Center for Disease Control, has a pamphlet that says you need to be very careful about consuming raw oysters because there is a chance that if you eat these raw oysters, they might have this bacteria that you can't see, you can't smell, and you can't taste it, but this bacteria is very deadly to you. Would these rules for the Israelites about having scales and fins eliminated the eating of oysters? Certainly they would. You know, I was delivering this material, and actually I think I had written an article about it, and it was on our website there at Apologetics Press, and I heard from a skeptic who said, well, you know, whoever wrote this, they just didn't know what they're doing because really they're keeping people from eating viable foods. And so why would these regulations be made when these people might be hungry and they could have these foods that they could eat, but no, this person who's writing this book is not letting them eat those foods? Well, the problem with that reasoning was, number one, God promised the Israelites as long as they kept the commands, He would bless them and make sure that they were prosperous and they would go into a land flowing with milk and honey, and He would keep them from getting the diseases that the various nations around them were getting. So you can't say, well, you're keeping people from getting good food that they needed to survive, because no, God had promised to bless them if they followed these rules. Second, God was feeding the children of Israel manna every single day. He was letting them recreationally eat ribeye steak, but it wasn't like they needed it to survive. On the contrary, what He was doing is making regulations for them that would keep them from getting the diseases from the nations around them. And there's just no way anybody can argue with the fact. Is it a fact that you're going to have a much higher percentage chance of getting some parasite or bacteria from an oyster than from any fish, any one that lives in the oceans or rivers that has both scales and fins? And the answer, the scientific fact, the physical absolute fact to that statement is yes. It's much higher percentage of a chance to get a disease from an oyster than it is from any fish, any one that has both scales and fins. In fact, I was looking up the other day the most deadly creatures in the world. Now, when you say that, I don't know what comes to your mind about deadly creatures. In my mind, I'm thinking king cobras, lions, things. I've heard that hippopotamuses are very deadly to people in certain areas, that they will attack unprovoked and things of that nature. But what you might find interesting is that the most deadly, not sharks and not lions or anything of that nature, the most deadly creature, kills more people than any other creature in the world is what? The mosquito. Through its carrying of malaria, kills about 1 million people every single year. And you don't think of mosquitoes as deadly, although if you've been to some evening get-togethers like I have in the middle of the summer and it starts getting to evening, especially when I was preaching down in Florida, I would sit out by this pond, and once it started getting evening, well, you had some mosquitoes that looked like they were going to fly in and carry at least parts of your body off because they were so big, and you felt like you were donating blood if you sat out there for longer than 20 minutes. I mean, they were big. But malaria kills 1 million people every single year, but I think the second most deadly creature in the world that kills more people than any other creature, I think it was somewhere around 20,000 or something like that every year, was a freshwater snail that carries a certain bacteria in its eggs. And so if you happen to eat this certain freshwater slug or snail that had this bacteria in its eggs, or drank water from that particular place where this snail or slug was, then 20,000 people every year die because of that. And so if you were to take that snail and you were to take it out and think, oh, I'd like to eat this, well, the regulation here in Leviticus would say, check real quick, does it have scales and fins? If it doesn't have scales and fins, cannot eat it. Did you know that to date, as far as any research that I've ever found has said, and I've looked extensively, there is not a fish that has both scales and fins that is venomous or poisonous in any way. This is the perfect regulation for eating stuff out of the water? Yeah. And then when you start looking at certain fish and various other swimming creatures and sea-dwelling creatures like the puffer fish. Well, you might think, oh, the puffer fish, it's pretty standard. There are a lot of people who eat the puffer fish. It's a food called fugu, F-U-G-U. Did you know that fugu is the one food that the Japanese emperor is forbidden by law to eat? Well, you say, why is the Japanese emperor forbidden by law to eat fugu? Well, it just so happens that there is a neurotoxin in certain organs of the puffer fish that is something like 1,200 times more deadly than arsenic. That if you were to get the tiniest drop that would fit in the dropper, the tip of a dropper, just one drop of this particular neurotoxin, it would kill 50 grown adults. Now, does the pufferfish have scales and fins? No, the pufferfish does not have scales and fins. So this would eliminate any type of freshwater slug, any type of oyster, any type of pufferfish. Now, lots of us like to eat catfish, but this would also eliminate any of the catfish because although they do have fins, what are they missing? They are certainly missing scales. Now, as you look at a catfish, even though a good fried fillet of catfish might be very enticing to many of us, we have learned how to cook them, etc. But what do catfish eat? That might be a better stated. What won't a catfish eat? And I remember as a teenager, I was told, hey, let me tell you what the best catfish bait out there is. The best catfish bait you can get is take a cheap hot dog and spray WD-40 on it and throw it out there. Now, WD-40 is a petroleum-based lubricant that's designed to knock rust off motor parts. So we thought, well, we'll give it a shot. Yeah, sure. So we took old hot dogs, sprayed WD-40 on them, and when they would go in the water, they'd leave like that little grease spot. And we went out to this pond that we were told had a bunch of catfish that we had permission to fish in, and we threw those hot dogs with WD-40 on them, and the catfish had a field day eating those, and we caught all kinds of catfish. A catfish that eats a hot dog sprayed in a petroleum-based lubricant? Well, yeah, because catfish they're omnivorous. They'll eat about anything. And if you've ever gone fishing with an avid catfish fisherman who has some concoction of chicken liver and garlic salt and motor oil and whatever else they put in there, and they won't even tell you their secret ingredients to the particular bait, but it stinks so bad that you want to keep it as far away from you as possible, then you understand, catfish are bottom feeders. Well, this would have eliminated the bottom-feeding organisms like catfish and oysters and various basically garbage recyclers of the water. And so another simple rule that at the time that people were writing this, you could not have said, Moses, why did you write that it has to have scales and fins? He couldn't have told you about the puffer fish, couldn't have told you about the freshwater slug or snail, couldn't have told you about any of the real scientific backing behind the regulation, but it just so happens after 3,500 years, this is still an amazing list that you could, now listen to me, that you could literally apply today in an area where you didn't have regulations like we do in the United States of America, and it would keep you healthier and you would avoid diseases that would be prevalent in a wild situation. Absolutely positive. You could still use these. But let's continue. As you're looking then at the flying creatures, it starts there and it says, okay, these shall be regarded as an abomination among the flying creatures. And it talks about the eagle and the vulture and the buzzard. And I always think, well, the vulture's pretty funny because, some of these probably seemed real, I don't know if they did to the children of Israel, but they do to me. Some of them just seem real self-explanatory. I mean, have you ever seen one of those bald-headed looking buzzards sitting on the carcass of a dead cow, eating that dead cow, and you drove by and you thought, you know, honey, I'll tell you what, let's forget the turkey next year and let's have buzzard for Thanksgiving. I think that'll be really delicious. You know, some of these things, you just see the environments where they live or the actions they're involved in, like eating dead carcasses, and you think, okay, I don't want to eat any of those. But then you get down to, well, you look right there in verse 19. The stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. Well, I mean, so what's the big deal with the bat? You say, well, I wouldn't want to eat a bat anyway. You know, I remember years ago. Now, remember, you're not supposed to touch them. You're not supposed to touch their carcasses. Certainly not supposed to eat them. I remember years ago, my dad brought home a little fruit bat, and I thought it was the cutest thing. Looked like a little mouse with wings, and it was all furry. And I thought, boy, I just want to pet that little thing. And I think I even went down to try to pet it right there on the top of the head. That's all I wanted to do. And it opened its mouth, and it had 4 of the sharpest, fangy teeth I had ever seen. And I thought, whoa, you know, I think I'll let you alone and not pet you on the top of the head. And I think at about that point, we decided we need to let that bat go anyway. Well, it just so happens that bats are a favorite menu item for many people around the world. There's something called a flying fox. And a flying fox, I think, weighs about 2-3 pounds. And lots of people eat flying foxes, which are bats. And they make soup out of flying foxes. And it might be one thing for people in the United States of America to say, well, I wouldn't eat a bat. But a lot of people around the world do. But it just so happens, here's what we found out. Maybe you've been keeping up with some of this COVID-19 stuff and have seen at least the suggestion that this virus came from bats to humans. Well, it just so happens that bats carry over 100 diseases that humans can catch. And not only do they carry 100 diseases that humans can catch, they assume, at least the veterinarians who deal with bats and bat contact between people, they say you need to assume that every bat you touch has some disease, especially rabies. And you need to get checked for rabies if you touch a bat. Not if you get bit by a bat, not if you eat a bat. If you touch one, you need to assume it had rabies and you need to go get checked for rabies. Because lots of bats have rabies and various diseases. And well, then you ask yourself the question, well, why don't they die of rabies? Just so happens, found out some new information that was interesting to say the least. Bats are constantly in a state of, I have a terrible disease and my body is fighting it. Now your body, if it was in that state, would literally consume its muscles and would burn itself out. When you get a fever, your body's fighting a virus or an infection of some sort, but you can't live in that state. Bats live in the state of, I have a bad virus, and they're always fighting it, but they're designed so that it doesn't consume their body and it doesn't burn them out, and they fly around very happily, unaffected by rabies, even though they have rabies because their body is on high virus alert all the time. Just lucky guess that Moses said don't touch or eat bats. Where I read the other day that there was a bat that had gotten on an airplane and flown around in that airplane, and before they would let the people off of that particular airplane, every one of them had to get checked for rabies because that bat had had so much contact with those people on the plane. Lucky guess. Perfect regulations for land-living creatures having a cloven hoof and chewing the cud. Perfect regulations for water-dwelling creatures having scales and fins. And then you start to see the list of the birds that are consumable. And you see bats are off the menu, and there's a great reason for that because they have 100 different viruses that humans can catch, and we've seen that be the case. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper, and then we'll conclude this lesson. When you go up to verse 29, these also shall be unclean to you among the creeping things that creep on the earth, the mole, the mouse, the large lizard after its kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand reptile, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. These are all unclean to you among all that creep. And then it says, not only are these unclean, but notice what it says, verse 32, anything on which any of them falls when they're dead shall be unclean, whether it's any item of wood or clothing. Any earthen vessel into which any of them falls, you need to break. If it has water in it, you have to get rid of that water. If it's metal or wood, you can wash it. Okay, what is that? Reptiles. Reptiles and amphibians. Any type of reptile they could not eat. Now, why is that? Just so happens, if you were to go to the pages of amphibian and reptile veterinarians, they will tell you 90% of the reptiles in the world carry some type of salmonella. I remember as a kid, we were catching little bitty turtles in the pond out behind our house, and we thought these little turtles were amazing. They were about the size of a 50-cent piece, and we decided we were going to take them to school and sell them. And so we were selling them at school for $1. We were doing great. We were selling all kinds of these turtles. They were easy to catch. Lots of people were buying them. And then the principal stepped in and said to my parents, you know, your kids can't sell turtles anymore at school. Well, why couldn't we sell turtles? Because it just so happens that turtles have a high chance of carrying salmonella. Now, they recommend that if you have a child 5 years old or younger, not to have a reptile in your house as a pet, because your child won't wash their hands properly and will not contact and come in contact with that reptile in a way that would be sanitary, and there's a good chance they're going to get salmonella. Now here's what's interesting. Salmonella is a bacteria that you don't have to touch the reptile to get. You just have to touch something that the reptile did touch. So if you had a lizard as a pet and he crawled across your kitchen counter, and then you cut lettuce on that same kitchen counter later that day, good chance that that salmonella was on your kitchen counter that you now have on your lettuce, and that lettuce is going in your salad, and everybody in your family gets sick. And that's why if a monitor lizard or chameleon or any of these reptiles or lizards touched any food item or any food preparation item that the Israelites carried, well, they had to wash it if it was washable, or if it was an earthen vessel, they had to get rid of it. Now, why was that? Because those earthen vessels are porous, and they have those little holes that would capture that bacteria. See what's going on? Another perfect regulation, just a guess. Moses just somehow gets lucky. Now, what you've got is divine direction, even to the point of regulating food, so that the science behind it was something that didn't catch up to the writing for thousands of years. But as we look back at it, we realize this had to be the writing, had to be the product of a divine, supernatural God who knew everything there was to know about the physical world. And when He spoke the world into existence and spoke His Word into existence, both the world and His Word, the science and the faith going together, when you put them in conjunction, well, they match perfectly. And we understand that the Bible is absolutely the inspired Word of the Creator.